Good day, good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to this is sort of like a 102nd podcast and somewhat of a sort of a special podcast. We sort of like, we were fawning over, Laver Cup last week and we had Susie on our podcast and we decided to have a response because, we don't want to be accused of being too much of a Fed fan, and which we are, and there's no shame about it, but we said we want to have a different approach. And before I go any further, let me introduce my hostess with the mostest because the my other hostess decided she's gonna be a parent and gonna put her child first. We feel about that. This is America after all. We don't pay you to do sort of like life when life gets in the way. So we have Andrine from Solely Tennis Travel. How are you doing,
Hello.
Andrine?
I'm good. I'm good. Since I have no children, I have the time.
Exactly. That's why we appreciate. That's why don't tell her, but we pay you more. I pay you more than I pay. I definitely
Bless.
pay you more.
Hmm.
And of course, there's reels. So we have a special guest this evening. Unless you are on YouTube, you wouldn't notice that there is a third person in our midst. But we have for you, Brian Boyd, all the way. I am going to say Ireland. Am I correct with that?
Hello, rest of the world. This is Team Europe calling.
And he's on Twitter as bboy27 at bboy27, and he's here to represent the sort of like ITF. I mean, the
No,
ITF is
no. He's just here to. He's just here to represent an independent view, a
right.
non-affiliated view. We need
Well, somebody got to
non-affiliated
stand up for the
views.
ITF because I mean, Maria has already eviscerated that organization quite recently. So I mean,
Brian, can
ITF
you
might
give
be
us
on
a
this
little
last
bit of
line.
background? A little bit of background, so our folks who are not familiar with your work.
There's no background to my work. I'm here to talk about the Laver Cup and the fact that this tournament has had an extended blowjob from the media since the very first day it was announced last year. And the media circus about the Laver Cup was simply ridiculous. It was a great event, don't get me wrong. Specific questions to ask about it. I think the Laver Cup, given the hysteria around it, can take a bit of criticism. My criticism of the Laver Cup is three-pronged. First of all, there was 12 players playing in Prague last weekend. I can pull quotes from each and every one of those 12 players, plus the two captains, who state quite unequivocally that the ATP run them ragged on an 11-month calendar. The reason why Djokovic, Murray, Raonic, all these players are injured is because...
Oh, hold on, Brian. Brian, I mean, you can just stand back because I don't want you to us to lose your intro because we can't distinguish.
Okay,
Some bits are coming in and out.
does it sound better now?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, I think I gathered you were saying that.
Yeah.
You were saying that that the Laver Cup had 12 players and pretty much you can basically bring crowds in with any combination of those players.
No, you can pull quotes from all those 12 players, plus the two captains, who have said publicly that the ATP calendar for men is too jam-packed. It's 11-month calendar, the players are run ragged. The reason why Murray, Djokovic, Raonic, etc. are injured is because the tournament is, the ATP has them playing too many tournaments. Roger says, I know, let's put on an extra tournament, and all the players go, yeah, great, let's play it. There's a problem there in the first place. The Laver Cup is not people have to understand, the Laver Cup is a renegade event. There are no ranking points. It's not affiliated to the ATP or the ITP. This is totally a one-man show. It was basically set up by venture capitalists. The problem with the Laver Cup is that it is owned by one of the players playing in the tournament. That would strike many as being unethical. Roger Federer's teammate management company own the Laver Cup. I presume also that they make money from it. This is the other problem. It's not transparent how much money is raised and where the money is going to. You were told that all the 12 players get appearance fees. That's fair enough. The winning team get each of the 6 players get $250,000 each. Obviously, there's 2 big stars. It's the Roger and Rafa show. In fact, if you had taken out Roger and Rafa from Prague last week, you're looking at a 500 event.
Really. That's too much. That's too generous right there, but okay. I was saying at 250, but okay.
Anyone in the right mind going to pay money to see John Isner play doubles? No, they're not. So the whole event was structured around Roger, and the whole thing about Kyrgios wasn't even picked for that team in the first place. He was only in because Del Potro got injured at the last moment.
No, that's not what happened. Tiafoe got in because Del Potro left. Nick Kyrgios
was not someone else?
Yeah, it was Tiafoe. Yes, it was Tiafoe. Del Potro. Tiafoe replaced Del Potro.
Was there not someone else?
I think Nishikori.
Yeah, and Nishikori. There were several other people that were not there because of injuries, but Del Potro was replaced by Tiafoe. Maybe because Nick was. Maybe Nick was replaced. Maybe Nick replaced somebody else, but Tiafoe replaced Del Potro.
The point I'm trying to make in a roundabout manner is that Kyrgios was never part of the plan. McEnroe didn't pick him. He was brought in because of injury. Okay, so the first problem there we're looking at with the Laver Cup is the fact that it's a tournament put on in an already packed schedule, and all those players have been saying there's too many tournaments. We need a break between the US Open and the Asia Swing, and suddenly they're all going, hey, great, I'm playing a tournament in Prague next week. The second problem is that if you look at the rank, now, but the whole thing is, it was based on the Ryder Cup, which is a very cute sort of idea, and this whole idea that Europe.
The Ryder Cup being, the Ryder Cup being a sort of a golf event.
It was the golf going for 40 years, and it's a massive cash cow, and it's very, very popular. But that whole premise was faulty. So you're looking at Europe versus the rest of the world. Only one non-European player has won a Grand Slam since 2004. 13 years. That was Del Potro at the US Open. So the dice was loaded from the very start. Even looking at the teams, you had Nadal number 1, Federer number 2, Zverev 4, Cilic 5, Thiem 7, Berdych 19. The rest of the world, the top seed was Sam Querrey at 16, then Isner 17, Kyrgios 20, Sock 21, Povlov at 51. Europe could have put out a second string team seeds. Now, if they had picked Dimitrov number 9, Pablo Carreño Busta at number 10, Goffin at 12, Batista Agut at 13, even their seedings. Now, I know that being a higher seed does not necessarily mean you beat the lower seed, but the whole idea behind it, and it just seemed to me that they had this sort of point system whereby you got 1 point for Friday's game, 2 points for Saturday's game, 3 points for Sunday's game. The whole reason behind this was, if you look at the Davis Cup weekend matches, they can be over on the Saturday afternoon. You win both singles, you win the doubles. You have the 2 dead rubbers. So the whole idea of the Laver Cup bringing in the scoring, which did work very well, it meant that you had this big climax on the last day. And what do you know? It came down to a final set tiebreak. Now, if you were to write a script, that would be the perfect script. So there was a bit of, all the people sort of talking about, it was so exciting towards the end and stuff. Well, it was designed to be so exciting towards the end. How much credibility can we have in what happened in Prague last weekend? I don't know. I'm open-minded. I think they needed a big show for the first outing, and they got a big show. That's fair enough. The third problem with the Laver Cup is its total lack of transparency. For example, I can tell you, everyone knows, Grand Slams, you go out in the first round of the French, we know how much the players are getting for first round losses, for second round losses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no information made available to any media about how much money the Laver Cup was generating and where that money was going to. Mm-hmm. It was set up by, Roger's own company, a Brazilian billionaire, and it was affiliated to Tennis Australia and the USTA. But it's emerged today that, as I said, all we know is they were all the 12 players were on appearance money. The winning team, Team Europe, got $250,000 each for winning. But it emerged today that Roger and Rafa were paid millions. And the rest of the teams were basically just given that basic appearance fee. Carlos Moya, Rafa's coach, was on today more or less saying that Rafa only played it out of a moral obligation to Federer. He was sort of critical, saying that it was the only non-mandatory event Rafa played all year. And the way he was talking about it was that, well, I'm not sure if I'll make Rafa available for it next year. So there's those 3 points about it. Why was the Laver Cup put into an already crowded calendar? The whole notion of Europe versus the rest of the world, when you look at the seedings, it would make sense for the women to play now, because if you look at the US Open, a rest of the world women's team versus a European women's team would be a very, very competitive match. The whole notion of men playing this global tournament made no sense. And third, the lack of transparency. Tennis, the money made by Wimbledon, for example, goes back into the grassroots in the UK. The UK is a cash-rich tennis country. So all the money, even with the US Open, all that money goes back into grassroots to develop the game, to grow the game. This is the reason why people get behind it, because they realize that the expensive fees they're paying for their tickets will go into the development of the sport. We have heard nothing from Roger, from Teammate, from the Laver Cup about where this money will be used, how it will be used. Is it just to pay Roger?
First of all, the critiques. I mean, let me just say.
I'm hearing a
Yeah, why am I getting okay? So the critiques are strange. First of all, you want the Laver Cup. You've already critiqued the Laver Cup as not being a part of the ATP, so it doesn't have to justify where its money is going, because it's a business venture. So that
it's venture capital.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what it is. So it doesn't have to justify itself. Like any business, it may be there as an entertainment form, and that's fine. But there's no obligation from any of the players to play. They are being paid to play it. And there is I'm assuming an appearance fee that gets agreed upon beforehand, contractually, what have you. The transparency issue, that's fine to sort of pull apart if it was a stamped ITF ATP event. But as you've said, it's neither of those things. We already know, second, that the players often say the calendar is crowded, partially because it's crowded with the exact same event. It becomes repetitive. It becomes repetitive to show up, play an event in God knows where, in front of how many crowds, whatever is happening without, it's just the same thing every time. One of the things about this is that it's different. And oftentimes people critique, they often say, oh, you say the calendar is very full, but you're showing up for this event or that event. We all know that those events have a different vibe to them. They have a different flavor to them. It's like, so we have to understand that these people are showing up at work 11 months out of the year. And if you offer me an opportunity to have a different work environment where maybe I'm working as a part of a team, where I'm being treated and feeded differently, I might consider it. It's not the same grind. So oftentimes that contrast to me is a bit faulty, to say, okay, well, how can you show up for an exhibition when you don't want to show up for a regular match? Well, a regular tournament has a different vibe than an exhibition where I'm hanging out with my friends and I'm sitting on the sidelines with my friends on a box having a great time. It's a different feeling.
I'm guaranteed at least $250,000.
Yeah, and I'm guaranteed payment to do the thing that I do well, which is to play tennis. Do you know? So I mean, I that critique I've never understood. That's always been the critique for lots of events, like, or lots of exhibitions. People are like, well, how are you showing up here? An exhibition is an entirely different vibe. It feels different to the player. The commitment value in terms of how much you want to win is different. All of those energies, those kind of intangibles, those aren't really known. So that feels like a different experience for the player. The transparency issue, I mean, I get your point in that, okay, you're interrupting the ATP calendar to offer this other thing. But businesses, I mean, I don't know how things work in other places, but in the US, really, it's kind of like if it's a 501c3 and it's a nonprofit and you're not paying taxes, those are the only time where people really expect you to be pretty forthcoming about where your money is and how that works. If it's a business venture, I think things get a little bit dodgier.
And I mean,
you know what I mean? Like point, that's a different feeling, you know, Brian.
Which is fine, Andre, but sport isn't a business. For example, the Laver Cup took place the same weekend last weekend that there were tournaments in Metz and St. Petersburg, ATP tournaments. There was a Davis Cup. There were Davis Cup ties the week before.
The week before.
Zverev was the defending champion in St. Petersburg. He didn't play because he wanted to play Laver Cup that weekend. He also didn't play, and he's in big trouble with the German Federation. He didn't play Davis Cup against Poland the weekend before because he wanted to keep himself for the Laver Cup. My point is, along the lines that sport isn't a business, is that the ATP tournaments in Metz and St. Petersburg, they generate money that go back into the game, to grow the game. The money generated by the Laver Cup, its sponsors are Rolex, Mercedes-Benz, and JP Morgan. What the fuck do they have to do with the growth of tennis as a sport?
Well,
first of all, that's one thing. I think the idea of something going back into the sport, first of all, you don't know how important it was for people to see tennis players in a particular light, maybe in seeing them in a totally different venue and what value that has. The overarching question you're having about whether it should feed back into something else, that's an open question. You're right. I don't necessarily know if businesses are required to do that and even justify their existence by doing that. Because really what you're talking about is a third lane entirely. You're talking about Laver Cup existing outside of ITF events and outside of ATP events. Those are three different things. And so the rationale for ITF existing in many places like the Slam, the USTA, and all that stuff, that money is supposed to go back into the sport. ATP, who knows? But this is a third question. So I don't know if you need to sort of like, I mean, and that's open, right? Obviously, should it go back into feeding the sport? I don't know. Maybe you could make a case for that, I think, but it doesn't have to in order for it to, to justify its existence.
But I want to add to something else because, I mean, but a lot of those same Mercedes-Benz, Chase, and Rolex, they sponsor regular tennis events throughout the year. In fact, Chase is pretty much owns the USTA, US Open. It's everywhere.
JP
and
Mercedes.
US Open.
And Mercedes.
Mercedes. But I just want to add that, I mean, you talk about like transparency. If I'm not mistaken, the British Lawn Tennis Association and the French Open, the French Tennis Association, had just had issues quite recently with misappropriation with funds. And there have been issues, I think.
Similarly for the USTA. No one knows exactly where this money goes.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that, there is supposed to be transparency in tennis, but we are well aware that tennis doesn't really have any transparency, that there are a lot of dodgy things going on in tennis on the regular tour.
Which is supposed to be the more legitimate tour.
Legitimate thing. I'm not saying that this justify any sort of like ills for Laver, but I'm just simply saying that if we are going to sit here and demand that Laver Cup show some sort of like moral fortitude and show us your books and show us everything, we need to know everything and everything has to be justified, then we need to start with the regular organizations because they too are very dodgy. And we can't sit here and pretend that is not the case. And I mean, I hear you. It is uncomfortable for me when it comes to your point about a tennis player managing, is involved in the business, and he's profiting from it and the unfair amount. But
see, that doesn't bother me as much. It doesn't bother me as much when it's in third event. However, we have tennis players who own legitimate events that give you points and have shares in events that give you points. That doesn't make sense to me. A third event, that's like you holding an event and saying, hey, let's get paid to play tennis. That makes sense to me. You guys are remember, again, this is the one thing everybody has said. Everyone has said that tennis players are independent individuals.
Contractors.
They're independent contractors. They get to sell their wares wherever they want to. That's the big challenge with these ATP WTA, right? It's sort of a weird tension because each player really is minding their own shop. So, but you have, if I'm not mistaken, isn't a tournament in it's not Barcelona, but isn't a tournament in Spain partially owned by David Ferrer? partially owned by quite a few players, and for some time wasn't Djokovic's family owning a tournament that actually gave out points. Do you know? I mean, so I'm just like I'm confused by that. Those tournaments feel like they have to be held to a higher standard than the Laver Cup, which fine, I totally get it, is entirely a business venture. That is entirely what that is. It seems to me anyway. Like I don't know how much stock one puts in that.
Theoretically, though, Andre, the USTA invests 100% of the proceeds, and I'm quoting here, to promote and develop the growth of tennis from the grassroots to the
theoretically,
but
there's no moral obligation for the Laver Cup. I'm talking about sport here having a moral obligation. If you picked up a newspaper in the last 10 days in the USA, you will realize that sport does have a moral obligation. It is not a venture capitalist experience. Sport is different to business.
Only depending on what it is. I mean, I think you have an interesting question though, because the question you're saying is that this is a sort of venture capitalist element, but I'm not entirely certain that's even an accurate portrait of it, because this is actually a partnership between the Laver Cup, the USTA, and Tennis Australia.
Okay, but what does partnership mean?
But that's what I mean. Like, I don't know what that part of it is unclear to me.
I'll tell you why Tennis Australia are on board is because it's named after Rod Laver. I'll tell you why USTA are involved, I believe, and again, there's no transparencies. In my opinion, is Katrina Adams was instrumental in bringing the Laver, who was head of USTA, instrumental in bringing Laver Cup to Chicago next year. Now, when I read Chicago, I thought, well, that's strange. First of all, Chicago is not a tennis city.
No.
There are other sports in Chicago that have a far greater purchase over public interest than tennis. In fact, Chicago last held a professional tennis tournament was well over 20 years ago.
Sure.
There is no tennis culture in Chicago compared to other centers.
But why would you go to a place that already has existing tennis elements when you have a place that doesn't have tennis? That probably, in their mind at least, makes it a competitive market once a year for a one-time event.
I was hearing the quotes from Katrina Adams and from the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, talking about bringing the Laver Cup to Chicago, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, we're doing this for the children, for the next generation." I don't
know about that. Well, I mean, it depends.
Yeah. It depends. When Rahm Emanuel is leading that conversation.
Rahm Emanuel and all of that element, I have no idea what that even means. But for me, the question you've raised, though, Brian, that hasn't really successfully been answered, is what is the relationship? And you're right. What is the relationship between a nonprofit organization such as the USTA? And I don't know what that status is in Tennis Australia, if that's exactly the same thing, and something like the Laver Cup. What are the obligations there that are involved? That's probably a more intriguing question than sort of painting the Laver Cup as entirely a venture capitalist model, because those two companies have specific obligations for their respective nations. No.
And I mean, I just want to say, Brian, I hear what you're saying, and I don't want us to come across as we're attacking you, and I think you're bringing legitimate points to the forefront. But what I'm a little bit, I guess, off-centered by, it said, why is it that, I think the first thing you mentioned was that this is an off-calendar event. You know, this is, everyone is complaining about this 11-month event. But the other thing is, players are not obligated to play every single tournament. They can manage their schedule. Mm-hmm. And if they have, if there are events that are mandatory, they can get a doctor's note. It is so easy for Rafa to get a doctor's note.
Yeah.
So easy. Rafa get a doctor's note for even getting a sneeze, and yet you see him out there playing. Players need to manage their schedule. Maybe what is part of the problem, maybe it's how the ranking system and point system and money is flowed within ATP. The players feel like they must play week in and week out. I mean, there is no obligation for players to show up for Davis Cup and Fed Cup. There is no mandatory obligation. Maybe if they're being sponsored by since they're part of their own national federation, then maybe there needs to be a different rule as to how that works. But let's be honest, most of those players, Laver Cup, would not have been playing in any of these ATP events and whatever. And you sort of like make it seem like it's an ATP event when it's only a 3-day event.
Okay, first of all,
it was only for 3 days. So players, so the sort of like physical, I guess the physical output by players wasn't the same as if they were showing up at a tournament. And as Andrew pointed out, it's a sort of a different vibe, so it's far more attractive and honestly lucrative for them to show up for this event.
Which is probably your problem, right, Brian? That no tournament can compete then.
Well, no, there's a much broader problem here, and here's my fourth point about the Laver Cup. You're talking about players making themselves available for tournaments, and the Laver Cup is a voluntary thing. No, it's not, because it basically killed off the event in St. Petersburg, which is an ATP event last year. Their defending champion, Alexander Zverev, didn't play it, didn't return to defend his title, instead played the Laver Cup. Zverev also, and he's in trouble over this, would not turn up to play Davis Cup for his country against Poland the week before. Now he's the top-ranked German player. My 4 point here is a far bigger picture. The Laver Cup was inaugurated this year. It's the power play by St. Roger Federer. He's flexing his muscles here. Roger has looked at there's turmoil now with the Davis Cup and the Fed Cup. It was announced last week, and this was a big announcement for the tennis world, that the Davis Cup and Fed Cup are being rejigged to the extent that the finals will now be staged in a neutral venue, which is Geneva, in December each year, and they'll be played on the same weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Switzerland is not starved of tennis. There's already a Geneva Open, there's already a Bâle Open, already a Zurich Open. Geneva is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's expensive to get to see tennis there. By killing off the Davis Cup, and the Laver Cup is I noticed that every single journalist last week reporting about the Laver Cup used the word ailing, the ailing Davis Cup and ailing Fed Cup in the reportage of it. Now, here's the point about Davis Cup and why it is so important. The way the Davis Cup is structured, you will get top players if they show up, and they haven't been shown up over the last 5-10 years out of greed and because they don't want to play 5 sets and get injured, and they want to keep their bodies fresh for the Masters 1000 series and the Grand Slams, which is a pity. Davis Cup is important because it brings tennis and it brings the top players to countries such as Albania, Mozambique, Tunisia, Kazakhstan. Down where I'm talking to from you now, the place I'm talking to you now is about a 10-minute walk away from where, when I grew up, there was this god on the television. He wore a headband, and his name was Bjorn Borg. He's the reason I first got a tennis racket in my hand. When I was a kid, Bjorn Borg came to play Davis Cup 10 minutes away in a club in Dublin where I'm sitting from now. And me and my friends ran down there. We couldn't get in, obviously, but we stood outside and we listened to the sound of Bjorn Borg hitting a tennis ball. We then ran off to the practice courts afterwards and played all night long, even in the dark, thinking that one day, if we practice hard enough, we can play Davis Cup. A few years later, John McEnroe had to come and play for Team USA in Ireland in Davis Cup. Many players out there who are in Tunisia, Albania, Mozambique, who have seen the greats of tennis come because the whole point of Davis Cup, global, international event, spread it around the world. I'm talking here about, this isn't a business. Sport is a different thing. Sport has a moral obligation.
But I get that, but Brian, I'm confused about this though. I'm confused about this. I'm confused about the point about Davis Cup, because this is something that ITF voted on making those changes, regardless of whether the players wanted it or not, right? Because they just said that they gave themselves permission to experiment with Davis Cup without having country members vote on that.
Yeah,
that's something that was determined within the ITF. So my question is, how is Laver Cup or anything else that comes out How is that pressuring ITF? What is it going to pressure ITF to do?
Because the Laver Cup was announced 14 months before it actually took place.
Okay.
Wait. Let me hear. So explain the pressure.
The Laver Cup, the idea for the Laver Cup was announced 14 months before it actually took place last weekend.
Yeah.
The ITF knew they were up against the star power of Roger. Roger can click his fingers and go, I want you, and Craig, and he will get them. The Davis Cup was already under threat because the top players simply, this is the pattern. You see, like Andy Murray went in 1 year, he won it for the UK. Potra went in 1 year, won it for Argentina. Djokovic won it. Federer won it. They all tend to win it just so they can tick a box on their tennis TV, and then they use the come. The Davis Cup is important because it travels to places that really have an impact and an influence on growing the game and bringing tennis out of its privileged status and putting the Davis Cup in Geneva next year as a permanent fixture and bringing it down from best of 5 to best of 3.
Which they decided not. They decided against that. But see, this is why I'm confused. This is why I'm confused, Brian. ITF has to lobby within its own structures for things that are going to work with the Davis Cup. Yes, you can look at a marketplace and say, the Laver Cup is coming and it's going to take our audience. I'm not even sure how it's going to do that. It will, because it's one part of the year. However, the ITF has decided that they're going to have the finals in Geneva for the next 3 years. The country back and forth is still happening. It's the finals. And it's the finals it's the finals. No, in the early rounds all the way up until the semis, you're still going to have the back and forth that happens with the countries. Supposedly their rationale for it, which I'm not sure, their rationale is that they're going to be able to make more money by having it in one particular location, which is then going to feed back into this system supposedly for growing the sport. So what is that tension? So I'm confused about. This is why I've been struggling all week with this competition between the Laver Cup. And you're right. A lot of sports journalists were like, Davis Cup ailing. You're right. And they're like, now the Laver Cup has put down a gauntlet. I feel like that's a really false flag because I think the Davis Cup has been challenged and the Fed Cup has been challenged for a couple of years. And it seems to me that ITF has not been listening to exactly what the players want.
That's exactly what I was about to say, because Fed Cup and Davis Cup have been struggling, not for a couple of years. I think I don't know if I'm
confused. What's the rationale behind that, Brian? Like, why is ITF not taking it?
Yeah, because ITF needs to take full responsibility of the situation. For years, not just 2 years, not just 14 months ago, players have constantly been complaining about Davis Cup scheduling, Fed Cup scheduling, people obligation having to play Davis Cup before a major tournament or after playing Davis Cup before a major tournament or after a major tournament. And they said they did nothing. They stayed silent. They never invited the players to see what they wanted to do. The players kept complaining. Every single press conferences, particularly around after majors, the constant question in the room would be, are you going to make yourself available for Davis Cup, etc.? ITF said nothing. And all of a sudden, Laver Cup was announced. And I'm sure, I don't have any proof of this. I'm sure Roger Federer probably went to the ITF when he was on the Players Council and asked questions and made suggestions. And they looked like they just completely ignored it. But Laver Cup was announced. And all of a sudden, ITF did a helter-skelter, I don't know what you call it, a hodgepodge plan, which was like, without any consulting the players, without consulting the country
apparently
members.
Jamie Murray says. Jamie Murray said that the ITF came in, the new leadership, Haggerty came in, had a conversation with them, listened to what they said, and the very next day basically said they're going to go do what they want to do.
Exactly. So you can't blame Laver Cup for that. That is mismanagement.
I want to figure out the ITF issue. Like, what is it? What is that box?
and you spoke about like, bringing tennis to other countries, the smaller countries, etc., like Mozambique, etc. No, I don't think you need Davis Cup to do that. You don't. ITF need to meet. There is a moral obligation that needs to happen. But tennis,
to grow the sport.
And I think this is the problem UST is having. I mean, we keep seeing the same set of looking people showing up. And if you're growing this sport in grassroots neighborhood, I don't see too many people of color showing up there.
And you know, and everyone was pretty critical about Chicago being chosen as a site for Laver Cup. But let's be honest, you know, Kamau Murray's site is there. Barack Obama's new library is supposed to set up there, as well as all kinds of like community supports. With Rahm Emanuel's involvement, I'm sure that's dodgy as best. But the question becomes, yes, Chicago's not historically a tennis town, but you know, Chicago is overwhelmingly a Black town. And there is a growing tennis community there, and there needs to be work done within the US to that end. So it's just like, I don't know so what obligation.
You bring the Laver Cup there. The UST is supposedly setting up organization to help grassroots tennis, whatever.
Supposedly.
And then you have excitement of like, you know, the biggest names in tennis. Because let's be honest, no one in Mozambique is pretty interested in John Isner. They're not. I know I'm not.
I mean, but I understand. But Brian does make a fair point about the grassroots efforts. You're right about that.
What legacy did the Laver Cup leave in Prague?
There's no legacy that the Laver Cup needs to leave in Prague because that's not its job. It's not its job. The legacy. What is the legacy the ITF is leaving?
I argue that the Laver Cup will have a legacy in Chicago. It will roll in town on Friday, roll out in town on Monday.
But that's fine. But what is the ITF doing? This is what I'm saying. You cannot take the mission of the ITF and put it on the Laver Cup. The Laver Cup, you're right. It is easy. It's going to go in and out. They're going to take that town. They're going to make money. They're going to get somebody excited. Maybe some kid is going to look and see somebody awesome and be inspired by that. Who knows? Maybe that's going to happen.
Andre, it is not fine because all ITF events, when we pay our money in, when we support these events, there's a contract there between spectator and sport that the money will filter down into the game. That's why
tell me why though. This is what I'm saying. You're defending the ITF without the ITF even taking responsibility for the work it's doing or failing to do.
I'm not defending the ITF, but at least the ITF are not venture capital.
But you know what? They may as well be if they're not going to take the players' concerns into consideration.
Venture capitalist companies.
That's what I don't understand.
All of those Tyriac tournaments all over Europe, they're venture capitalists. People are investing, and venture capitalists are not just investing in tournament. They're investing in players. So if we're talking about removing ourselves from venture capitalists altogether from the sport of tennis and Laver Cup, most tennis players without Laver Cup in existence can't survive. And I mean, what I'm hearing from you, and I think it's not just from you, I think Elijah Cup, is that everyone wants to blame the Laver Cup for the death of tennis or the impending doom of tennis.
For this week.
When for 3-day event, when in fact, but I mean, Brian, I just want to say that much of the issues that you are talking about, that you've mentioned, have been in existence in tennis for a very long time before Laver Cup was even a dream.
It's enduring.
It's been around for a long time, and the ITF has done for none of these issues that you have pointed out any sort of like public or any concerted effort from the ITF that I have seen. I could be ignorant, and I'm opening up to fans to let me know, and you as well, that they've to address any of these problems. The Davis Cup issue, as we've pointed out, the players are not happy with the Davis Cup issue, and this had nothing to do with Laver Cup.
Okay. Or anything that the WTA might create as an aside to Laver Cup. So I'm just confused though. I'm concerned though, because I think you're right. I understand the value of ITF. I really do. I understand this notion of growing the sport, because you're right. There is no obligation on Laver Cup to do that. It probably won't even put it in any of its final year report, its annual report, if it's going to do that to its investors. That's not even clear that that's a part of its mandate. However, the ITF has that as part of its mandate. And yet you've had players say year in and year out, we need to change this so that we can happily contribute to this. We like playing for Davis Cup. We like playing for Fed Cup. But instead, what we have happening in August is the ITF essentially going around the players and deciding that they're going to be able to test out whatever model they see fit without the countries voting. Because remember, the leadership of the ITF wanted the best of three. It was actually when the countries that were part of it voted that it got knocked down because people were fine with best of five. But then at the same time, you have the players saying, okay, we want a different schedule. every 2 years, possibly. See, I mean, so to me, it just strikes me as very odd to choose an outside villain, which is fine. Your critique of Laver Cup, totally fine. But the question for me is like, what is the ITF doing to respond to the challenges that were raised by the actual players for the event? And you're right. You know what? You also right, Brian, that unfortunately for the Davis Cup and Fed Cup, those two things existed before these major stars of the game. And unfortunately, what happened is that these things became check boxes for the major stars. You're not a major star unless you've won the Fed Cup. You're not a major star unless you've won Davis Cup.
And that was started by the media.
That was a narrative that reporters published and pumped up, and people should have been pushing back on that all along. Because really what you ended up doing was forcing these players to take on this mantle. And once they finished with it, they were done.
And it became a mental chore. It became like this. It wasn't supposed to go to Davis Cup and have a good time. It was supposed to add to your career. I mean, because let's be honest, Davis Cup was never really that, but wasn't the fifth major until Andy Murray only had one US Open, and Andy Roddick had one US Open, and Andy Murray was out here struggling to win a major.
They did it a disservice, you know. They did it a disservice.
When it came to Roger Federer, they're like, "Well, Roger, you have everything except the Davis Cup." And look at Rafa. Rafa got a lot of Davis Cup.
They used it as a weapon, and unfortunately,
exploded in their face. They never actually checked the real value of it. Because I mean, I am disappointed that it's going to Geneva, because who's gonna be in Geneva cheering? I mean, we all know Thomas Berdych was on that Laver Cup team because it was in Prague. And we all know. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, from what I was watching from the TV, I mean, we all know
he didn't win any of his matches either. He didn't win any of his matches,
right? And I mean, it was like I said last week. It was like Thomas Berdych showed up at his birthday party and everybody was excited by the guests and not him.
But like, you know what? Let's just backtrack a little bit. Brian, you've been talking. You understand the value of the of Davis Cup and Fed Cup. You've really made that clear. What should they do? What should they do? You know, aside from this competition, because you know what? You're right. Laver Cup was a standout. There's no guarantee it's going to be a standout next year. It's a new business. These new businesses falter all the time. What should the ITF and the folks who do Fed Cup and Davis Cup be doing? Because they seem to be choosing things that are not working.
But Brian, you also need to acknowledge something that was rather interesting that came out on the Fed Cup, particularly on the American side. When the big names didn't show up, they got blasted for that. Yeah. When the big names showed up, the people who were there were like, "Oh, well, we put us here. We don't want you here. You're not part of the team," etc. So you have all sort of like internal issues within these organizations. And I think it's like, and let's be honest, people show up for Fed Cup just for Olympic qualification. Maria don't usually. Let's be 100 about that. And then the Olympics became another thing where we need an Olympic gold medal when no one was checking for Olympic. No one is telling Steffi Graf that she needed an Olympic gold medal in order to be Steffi Graf. She just got an Olympic gold medal because that was a Golden Slam. Okay. So I mean, I think we need to like let's take Laver Cup out of the picture.
Yeah.
And let's sort of like look at what can be done with the issues that are facing Fed Cup and Davis Cup. How can we fix those issues?
Okay, just 2 quick points here. First of all, 2 years ago when Andy Murray won the Davis Cup for the UK, the British tennis media were all, "Oh my God, the Davis Cup is the most important thing in the world."
Yes.
Exactly. It was the career weave. It was the resume weave. When you don't have enough length on your resume, you add Davis Cup and it gives it extra inches.
So the ITF have allowed the Davis Cup and the Fed Cup to wither on the vine. It's because Davis Cup and Fed Cup have an important social and financial input into the game. They generate money for the game. They spread the sport. Fed Cup and Davis Cup travel to these places that normally don't have tennis events. They inspire people who don't normally go to tennis. The rest of the world captain cheering all weekend long for the Laver Cup last weekend, John McEnroe, has spent his career berating every single person from Jimmy Connors to Andre Agassi to Pete Sampras for refusing to play Davis Cup for the USA. Here he is last weekend participating in a tournament which is designed, and let's make no bones about it, it's designed to replace the Davis Cup.
I mean,
I don't agree with that statement at all.
I don't think it will, because first of all the shortcomings you've just identified is why the Laver Cup cannot replace the Davis Cup. It cannot go to countries that cannot afford it. It can only be represented by 12 players. The Davis Cup covers so many other players, so many other countries, all the different world group zones, all of that. The Davis Cup is a monster. But if people continue to conceive of the Davis Cup as competition for the Laver Cup, you're right, it is going to lose. But that's why I'm asking, how do we conceive of the conversation? You're right, the media is completely in the bag with that. They're doing it too, but they were the ones that destroyed the Davis Cup in the first place by the way by the narrative they generated around it. But the question is, how do you talk? Because you're right, ITF is doing something that's really complex. It's intangible in many ways, right? How do you know that you're touching a young player's life? How do you know that the impact you're going to have that whole week, what have you, whatever you're doing? That makes sense to me. But I've yet to hear anyone ask.
But Brian, I mean, like, you also have to acknowledge that the ITF and the ATP are in two different businesses. They're two different goals. ATP and WTA is about generating money.
Yeah.
Ideas that ITF has. So the ITF isn't just dealing with.
Although you're it's interesting you say that, because many people perceive the ITF as a fundraiser. I have many people who call it a fundraiser on my timeline. Every time it comes around, it's a 4 times a year fundraiser, and they're not entirely certain how those things are actually growing the game. So that's the real tension as well,
But I mean, like, what I find interesting about this as well is that we're here bashing the Laver Cup, but Hopman Cup is happening just at the beginning of a major tournament. There are no points, but everybody loves it because it's country thing, and there are actual ATP events. And look at this year. I mean, for the past 3 years, I think it is, or 4 years, Laver Cup has been able to draw the top player, whether it was Serena. Hopman Cup, sorry. Whether it was Serena showing up or it was Roger Federer this year. Hopman Cup became the hottest ticket. No one was concerned that Grigor was winning Brisbane. And
it took away from that, actually, right? This is what I'm saying.
Because we're concerned about Federer's comeback.
But you see, this is what I don't like. I don't like people. I get it. I get it. You know what? I get it. Federer is a villain and a savior for many people. That makes sense. That's fine. You can have all of those feelings about it, but you've got to stop confusing. People have got to stop confusing the issue. There are legitimate concerns about the viability of Davis Cup and Fed Cup that's not being answered. And you're right. Laver Cup doesn't have those burdens. It's coming once a year. 3 days, it's done, it's over, it's all of that. They have no tension about, oh my God, is my country going to pay? All those kinds of things are gone. That makes sense. That's a small business in some ways, or a big business, if you could call it that. But the question for me is, how is the current governing body of ITF dealing with the legitimate concerns that have been raised? It seems to me that they actually didn't, Brian. Do you like the new, I mean,
they just panic.
Andre, let's take the ITF out of this equation for a second. The question we're asking here is, why do players whinge, moan, and bitch about the Davis Cup, but for the Laver Cup, they're jumping up and down all weekend in excitement?
Guaranteed money.
We should look
guaranteed money. Guaranteed money. It's not always. It's a different atmosphere. It's guaranteed money. There's no social pressure. Yeah. Wait.
The output isn't the same. The game structure is different. And I mean, let's be honest. I know you watched it. I know you watched it with some hateration in your eye, but you watched it. But I mean, it was a sort of a different vibe to see the players. Well, I'm not very much excited about the world team except for TFO. I'm curious.
Unless we stuffed it with all Central Americans and South Americans,
exactly.
We'd be okay with it. But let's expand this.
I thought Juan Monaco retired too soon because Juan Monaco would have looked so cute on that world team. But I mean, the Laver Cup on the European side, it was exciting to see the top players there and interacting with each other and not having to think of each other as competitors. And you might talk about the fact that about like a young person might be excited and might be changing their world. But I'm sure a lot of those players who were there, their world probably changed and their perception probably changed by just the experience of being close with each other, an interaction and that they wouldn't have had otherwise at any other event. This can't happen at Davis Cup. This can't happen at Fed Cup. This can't happen in Miami.
Which is why I'm so annoyed that the three of them are being pitted, because I feel like there's value to all three. You have Davis Cup, which is about teammates, same country. That vibe is there. This is another. I don't know if Laver Cup's going to last. We have no idea whether that's going to last. Right. You're right. It was a shot in the dark that first year, because you're right. It was the Fedal show. Are people going to be interested if Fedal doesn't show up in some ways the next year? I'm not certain about that. But the question I know that if Laver Cup falters next year, you're still going to have the same problems with Davis Cup. We're still going to have the same problem with Fed Cup. And that's my question. Exactly. Like, if it does falter,
and it's not going to be Laver's Cup fault at all.
Or whatever. You're right. I mean, there's a tension. There's a tension, right? There's a tension because Nick played both, right? Nick played Davis Cup, and he then showed up and played Laver Cup. So maybe nothing else happened on the calendar during the Davis Cup weekend. You're right. But the other thing for me is like, why does tennis not use its forces to buttress each other? Because we were talking about this on our podcast. Like, okay, you're right. St. Petersburg, although it looks to me like people showed up, it was not a bad crowd for that final. People were showing up. You had some breakthrough players there. And there was also another Metz, right? Which, let's be honest, the Frenchies always show up to watch other Frenchies play. Those tournaments generally have like a very strong internal country specter. The biggest problem for the Metz was the fact that Davis Cup happened the weekend before. So it probably depleted all the players that lost that following week. Depleted Tsonga, depleted all the other players who played.
And money, and let's be honest, the French boy don't show up at the beginning of the year, middle of the year.
It had an impact on them, right? But nobody's upset about that because, of course, it's Davis Cup is the greatest thing ever. So no one should be upset about that. But this is what I'm saying. The nature of the calendar necessarily messes with people because you're right. The Frenchies had a French tournament immediately after their Davis Cup piece, and some of their French players lost out in terms of energy and exhaustion, what have you. But my question is, why wasn't it possible for us to highlight what was going on in St. Petersburg while at Laver Cup? You have a massive audience there. Why couldn't you have done that?
The positive thing about the Laver Cup for me, the only positive thing was what we saw last weekend. It gave us a glimpse into the future of tennis for the Instagram generation. What they did very well, and I'm not a hater of the Laver Cup, I just have legitimate critical questions.
No, you have to be critical. Yeah, I think you're right.
What we saw in Prague last weekend is how we are going to be viewing tennis over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Was that good news or bad news for you, though? Because, that's always a challenge, right?
It looked to me at times like a reality TV show. There was the locker cam. We've never seen the locker cam before.
Although, you know what? The Australian Open tried, remember? The Australian Open tried with the behind-the-scenes camera because they understand that the demands of a TV audience, right, is that they want as much intimacy as possible. But remember, people push back on that. People push back on that.
And we can do this similar. We can do this at Laver Cup because you have a team. We can't fall around 50 million people around because here at the Laver Cup, they are hanging out together as a team.
It's only 2. Yeah, it's different.
Yeah. But
wait, Brian, tell us anything else that you noticed. Sorry, Reels. I just wanted to.
It was very funny watching all the bro romances over the weekend. It was very.
Yeah, and I know some of it is not real because
very innovative. That new camera thing, but the locker cam and this whole thing about the cameras were usually more focusing on the players' reactions. The point as opposed to we can play. I thought maybe, but I thought in the Laver Cup in a few years' time, because it's been redone in the sort of through the prism of a Kardashian reality TV show, that they're going to have a phone vote to select the teams.
Probably. Well, listen, I mean, probably because that if you're not getting points for it, then creativity increases. Because the question we asked is, let's be honest, who's part of the team next year? Do you know? Because you're right. You know, all it says on the Laver Cup website is that you are going to be chosen based on your ATP ranking, but it doesn't say what those rankings need to be.
Yeah,
so then the question becomes, and then also because it's a partnership between Tennis Australia and USTA, the question I wondered is, does it always have to overwhelmingly be you know, those country heavy
American players?
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, and so I'm curious next year, like, who's a part of it, because in some ways it's almost like a growth piece. You know, I think you need Fidel for it, but the younger players are going to have to come in for it.
But had the players not been injured, had Nishikori and Del Potro not been injured, Laver Cup would have looked quite different. And I don't think people would have been asking some of these other questions as they were. And I mean, I thought Laver Cup, like, I mean, it would have been more balanced. Like, you would have had a bunch of top players on both ends.
But think about people didn't think about that when the Ryder Cup was happening and Tiger Woods was ultimately the best player. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's always a tension about which team is going to be stronger. What I think the Laver Cup pointed out is how Europe heavy tennis really is. That's what it highlights, is how essentially the growth of
and how none of these players can play doubles.
And you know what? No, but you know what, Brian? Have you thought about this though? Have you realized that, or maybe I don't know if this is in terms of the Davis Cup conversation? Maybe this is actually a reflection. Maybe Laver Cup actually pointed out something that has part of why Davis Cup has struggled, is because of the dominance of like these fairly wealthy European countries.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like if for example your stars were coming from maybe some of the poorer countries or like a South America, or you know what I mean? Like if your stars were mixed up, you pointed out. You know what I mean? Do you think that we would have even had this tension around the Davis Cup the last 5 to 10 years?
Exactly. I think and the Laver Cup basically constricts it even more. You're talking about the best players in the world. The Davis Cup at least brought in fresh faces, brought in fresh countries, gave them a chance. There was some growth of the game involved. Tennis was going to other places, but now it's going to like Chicago.
But no, wait, Brian, you've missed my point. You've missed my point entirely. What I'm saying is that part of the cost for the Laver Cup is the predominance of Europeans. And so you have Spanish, you have the Swiss, you have the Brits. If you have these wealthy countries who basically feel like they have a surplus of resources, Davis Cup would necessarily seem like a pressure thing, seems like an additional thing for somebody like that. If you had dominance by, say, smaller countries, you might have had a different appreciation for the Davis Cup, and maybe it's the way it was highlighted publicly. Do you know what I mean? But in some ways, the Laver Cup model lets you see, oh shoot, we've been dominated by the Europeans in Davis Cup, and they feel like it's extra because many of those countries already have so much support.
And I mean, two things I want to mention here. Sorry, I'm trying to ask a question, Brian. You can respond to that question.
No. Go on. Sorry. You know, I
wanted to say two things.
I totally agree with what I'm doing the same. But it is a shame.
Tennis is a professional. I'm sorry. Tennis is a professional sport. It's a pro sport, and it has to compete with the likes of NBA in basketball, NHF, NFL. One of the things I think Laver Cup is soon going to find out is that next year they might not get as many eyeballs in America as they did this year.
Sure.
Tennis at 8 o'clock, but next year when tennis is going to start at 11 o'clock on a Sunday, everyone's watching football.
Yep.
People might show up somewhere on a Sunday for Friday's matches, but Saturday it's college football, and Sunday it's gonna be Major League Football. So
tennis can't compete. Yeah, it can't compete with the U.S. calendar.
Tennis can't compete.
Remember, it won't be Team USA next year. It's Team Rest of the World, so you won't be getting that horrific USA chant.
Well, yeah, but there's never room for that horrific USA chant at any event.
But also the dynamics, dynamics of the Chicago crowd, the cost of the ticket, all of that. Yeah.
But have to admit, and I've decided like it's been that some small element, is that part of what has happened here to Davis Cup is that tennis cannot have its cake and eat it too. Journalists, we have to acknowledge that they have been the one to frame a lot of this situation, and they haven't been nuanced and they haven't been accurate reporting and actually fleshed out. They just want to do a lot of Instagramish and put out tweets out there, but they're not covering a full story that is deeply studied and researched. Because again, all of the things that we're talking about that's been affecting Davis Cup has been happening for a long time. And reporters, the same reporters who have been bashing Laver Cup, saying Laver Cup is threatening Fed Cup and Davis Cup, they're the same one who've been bashing Davis Cup and Fed Cup.
I know.
14 months ago. So
they did a poor job. They did a poor job of highlighting. Honestly, they basically framed the lens of Davis Cup really poorly. I think tennis fans, listen, I'm not a huge fan of either of these competitions in any particular way. But one of the things I've noticed is that anyone who watches Davis Cup immediately understands the value of it. They all do. You see players, they're so enamored of competing for their country. People who, who would have figured that Steve Darcis would beat like Nick Kyrgios, right? You wouldn't put them on an ATP calendar event and be like, and say Nick Kyrgios is going to lose to this person, but no. Or Goffin, yes, a little bit more competitive, but these people bring something different to the table. However, for the people who have been covering the sport for the last 5 to 6 years, or however many years that I've really been paying strong attention, they have always put Davis Cup and Fed Cup within the lens of the top players. They've never talked about the value of what Davis Cup does. They've never highlighted what Davis Cup is supposed to do. The things that you're highlighting, Brian, they've never done that. They don't go behind the scenes and look at and say, okay, Davis Cup is coming to this country, it's touching these people, it's doing this. No, all they've done is put it on someone's resume as something that has to be done, as an obligation or as an inconvenience. So you've kind of inculcated an entire generation of people into how to think about the Davis Cup. And I was just, in preparation for this, I was reading Yannick Noah, and he was saying, he's like, maybe everything isn't about money. And I get it, but you spent the last 5 to 10 years telling us it was all about money.
I mean, but let's not forget, and again, it's how the narrative works, right? It's the easiest cop-out thing, I think, in journalism too. It's easy to pick a villain and to pick a hero, and nobody wants to look at the broader trends and the implication. Remember in 2010, before tennis was invented, according to Nole Fam, Nole was struggling to win a second major, and everybody got so excited. Oh, Nole won Davis Cup, and Serbia got into the finals. And then, he's a new man, and John McEnroe was like, I really think, like the Davis Cup win really renewed him. And then Novak went on a tear.
It became a means to an
about
end.
The fact that what's his name was struggling with the other people on the Serbian team, that they couldn't find their way out of paper bag. So it's the journalists have to be, if Davis Cup is important to us and Fed Cup is important to us, we can't sit and talk about the new enemy, because this Laver Cup just came on the scene yesterday.
Well,
we have to do a better job of reporting it and giving the value and doing accurate reporting, because we see one thing
we can all agree on, Reels, is that the Laver Cup was a great success. I wanted to check with Andreen, and this is a very specific question. They're now talking about a women's Laver Cup similar format next year.
Mm-hmm. Who's lobbying for that?
The players. Well, the women's game have sort of looked at the Laver Cup. They've looked at the eyeballs on it, and they've sort of gone. And everyone's going. It looked like fun. It was tennis for the Instagram generation. All the different camera work, all the the teams together and stuff. So the women's, I have heard, are looking at bringing in a female equivalent. If that were to be the case next year or the year after, who would you call the cup after?
It can't be Peggy.
No, it's Billy. It's the Billy Cup.
A team captain for a team that's the world.
But we have that already. There is a Billie Jean Cup thingy.
What is it?
Square Garden.
No, not anymore. It might have been, but it's not anymore.
That's what it's called, the Billie Jean Cup. That's what you're playing for.
No, what? Which one?
About whatever.
Which one?
The tennis day thingy, whatever.
No. It's World Tennis Day now. It's been reframed. I mean, I at the time, I mean, obviously, who's like the most signature person in women's tennis, really? I mean, the person that it is, for Laver, it's easy, right? Because he doesn't say much. Yeah. So he's not objectionable.
Even when you have a microphone in front of him, he just like, why am I here? I swear it looks like they just take that man out of his day, out of retirement home.
Listen, the sad thing is if Market Court hadn't turned herself into a rabid racist and homophobe, you probably could have made a case for her, right? And then you'd have teams with, like, say for example, the team that you would imagine being coached by Billie Jean King, right? As a coach, that'd be really amazing. Right, and then and like a Steffi Graf, like Steffi Graf would be like Europe, yeah, because she's the great thing about her in the Sims.
Anna Rancha. I mean, come on now.
Similar to sort of Bjorn is that Steffi Graf is kind of like quiet, right? In the sense that you don't really know. So to be able to have access to her in an experience like that, Steffi Graf definitely coaching Europe, because we just don't have access to her. So I think that'd be a really clever way to involve
Arantxa second in command. I want Arantxa there.
You can find Arantxa if you want. But Steffi Graf to me is like an unknown element because she's been so far away from the game. And it'd be a great way to bring her in.
Steffi's very cold and distant, though. She's a very cold, distant, great player, but cold, distant person. I would go with Judy Murray for Team Europe.
I wouldn't, because you'd have.
I see Judy too much.
And you know what it is? I get the Judy thing, and in some of I could see that, but what I really like is the idea of listening to an ex-player. You know what I mean? Like, because that's what you want, right? You want to hear, but you're right, that is part of the challenge with Steffi. She seems a bit remote, but you want the winningest person to tell you what their strategies are and what their thinking is. But we already have that for Chrissy, and unfortunately,
she as a player might be different as she as a coach. She might be different as a coach.
Unfortunately for Chrissy Everett, she's done herself a disservice. But so it's
too much.
Wait, is Navratilova is officially an American citizen, right?
She's paid American Fed Cup.
Yeah, so for her, yeah, I would put her. I mean, imagine finally somebody letting Navratilova do what she wants and say what she wants to a team.
God, exactly. You can't shut her up. She won't be.
But Brian, the thing that worked about is that you had former rivals competing as coaches, right? So the ideal would have been if you had Navratilova and a Chrissy team, right? Yeah. But because they're in the same country now, it doesn't work. But what you want is like maybe Celis. Celis could be interesting.
Is she not American citizen though?
That's the thing. American citizen. Everybody's becoming Americans.
They have to. They have to. Because Europe was quite different in the 1980s and 70s. Europe was not.
So we're gonna have to go to Spain to get the European captain, right? Because this is the thing, right? What's nice about it is that the carryover of the rival legacy on court. That's kind of interesting. Maybe like Yvonne Goolagong, is that her name as well? She could be interesting.
Yeah, from Australia.
From Australia, she'd be great. Be nice. Yeah, she'd be interesting. Even Margaret Court. I mean, I hate to say it, she's controversial, but she is. I mean, if you're gonna separate,
we need drunk Virginia on the bench. We need a drunk Virginia Wade under the crowd. Yes.
Virginia Wade would be great because again, see, one of the things I think, the men's side of the tour does really well that the women's side of the tour is starting to do, especially because they're celebrating the original ladies with the $1 and all of that. Is to be able to like really bring in the predecessors in the sport, but more publicly, so you see them. I hear their voices. I hear Virginia Wade quite a bit, but I'm not always seeing her. I think within the last couple of years, the WTA has done a much better job of like introducing you to some of the folks from the other generation. But I mean, what do you think? I mean, I feel like Billie has a lot of legs in terms of recognition. I think if people heard...
Her name is there on something. I'm looking for a different name for the female Laver Cup, not the Billie Jean King Cup.
I know, I would love a different name, but I mean, oh, you know what we could do? Gibson. Gibson Cup, the Gibson Cup.
Yep. I'm all out there. I'm all for that.
Althea Gibson could be really fun because then it'd be like an introduction because, you still have to introduce people to Laver Cup, right? Not everybody knows who Laver is, really. They've done a lot of rebranding to let you know who he is, but nobody really cared about these things until the last 10 years or so. So you could still do the same thing with Gibson, which is like back introducing in the day, people.
Win 2 majors and be cute. All of a sudden, we gotta win all 4. You're nothing. What are you doing?
I'm lobbying. You got
one French Open. What's that about?
Brian, I'm lobbying for that. Let's call it the Gibson Cup.
Gibson Cup is good.
The Gibson Cup is good because it's brand new.
Your team captains are who?
My team captains are. I definitely think I'm going to go with Virginia Wade for Europe. I think that'd be really interesting. She has a lot to say.
You gotta bring the gin.
She has a lot to say. And you know what's great about her? She's really familiar with all the current players. So definitely
doubles. Yes, she's very good at giving advice when it comes to doubles, at least commentating wise.
And I gotta see Virginia go up against Navratilova.
Okay, interesting.
I know. What do you want? Who do you want on your team? I'd be interesting to see if people are going to do this though. It'd be fun. Immediately people wanted it.
I definitely have Judy Murray Team Europe because I think she's done great stuff, and she's got a good voice, good independent voice. And she, think about Judy, she hasn't come from that tennis background. She comes from that small place. So she isn't like weighed down with baggage.
Yeah.
And she just goes off message sometimes the same way. And you see Andy goes off message sometimes, which is great, so I'd like her. And I think she's got a bit of spirit, bit of character. To work for the USA team. Oh, who would I pick?
USA is kind of crazy.
I wouldn't pick Chrissy Martina, Billie Jean, because they're everywhere. They're at everything. You turn around and they're there talking about something.
That's the thing about Chrissy. She'd have a good time.
And she'll have a secret flask.
I don't know.
Pam Shriver, Pamela.
Yeah, she's again a bit sort of bossy.
I don't like Sam. I'm not a huge fan of Shriver. You're right.
Mary Jo. But then we're gonna have the venture capitalist. We're gonna have the venture capitalist angle again because her husband owns. Yeah. So.
No, but no, it would be interesting to see who kind of emerges out of the conversation, whether you needed to have been a player or not. I mean, Judy was like a maybe like a small time player, or was she just not in? I don't remember if Judy ever played tennis.
She played, but she'd be like first round loss. She was a good player.
Yeah.
I think it might not have to be Team Europe or whatever. We can just have a Navratilova team and a Chrissy team or something like that. We just have because in other sports, in other huge professional sports, except for soccer, I think, and cricket has county cricket, there is this sort of an all-star weekend. Imagine Laver Cup is something like that, and I totally understood how that works, and there is great value, particularly in NBA when they stop the calendar, and this is placed smack in the middle, and you have all these players.
We were talking about when the calendar would make sense, but it's just you're right. The ATP, the calendar is quite packed. Couldn't see when it would make sense. It would only make sense in like a November. Ooh, maybe like a Gabrielle. Yeah. You know what? You could also have it. You can have like a Sabatini. She's kind of like she's very popular. Sabatini is extremely popular. I think having her back in the game in a way that would be compelling for the audience would be really fun. Yana Novotná.
What about Lindsay? We forgot Lindsay, but I guess that's too current player.
Yeah, I mean she's kind of still in it. Jennifer Capriati. You can sort of rebrand everybody. You just give them a chance to get their careers all over again, get their careers started.
the 6 murder sisters of the Cell Block tango now.
But you know what's interesting?
We don't need Jenny.
You're right.
We don't need Jenny anyway in front of the camera.
But he's right in the sense that you would probably have a pretty strong team. Because what you can tell is that Europe
it would be more balanced. It would be more balanced. More balanced. It would be a more balanced team. But then again, you have one of the reasons why USA is popular is because you have players who existed outside of the USTA organization. If we take Venus and Serena out of the conversation, it might be more equal on that end.
Well, no, I mean because they're both older
star
now.
Power.
Yeah, star power. You can't have like an event. Power. Yeah. I mean, and you don't have like a sort of Fadal energy where, oh my God, the only thing you have is something where it'd be competing against each other for points. There's nobody that you want to see in a dream doubles per se. Obviously, it'd be something like a Sharapova and Serena, but they're not going to be together on the same side, even though people forget Sharapova is Russian. So she'd be with Europe, y'all.
She should be Team Europe. Does American branding and marketing and use that, but he's Russian.
But I mean, like
that message.
So I was in terms of getting some background on this stuff too. So basically, moving forward, they are going to do the Geneva thing, 2018 on. Mm-hmm. They are doing that. That'd be interesting to see. Yeah. See, what I would do is if I were them, I would be players and I would see how come players don't recognize that they have the ability to strike.
Yeah, and this is what gets me annoyed.
It's that like you
can't sit there and complain and fire off a tweet, and then the ITF shows up and say, "Oh, this is where you have to go," and you said, "Yes, okay, that's what."
Show up. Do you think players could launch? Could players do that in your mind, Brian? Just decide as a group.
There was a case in the Davis Cup. I'm going back 20, 30 years ago now, where if you didn't make yourself available for your national team, you were barred from 6 months from playing any tournament, which meant you couldn't play in the slams. You couldn't play. There was a famous case. There was a boycott of Wimbledon in 1973 because a Yugoslav player, I believe.
See, I think they took all. They took all the sting out of it. Did you know? You noticed that? That's the other thing too that happened with Fed Cup too. It's like they changed the obligation. Who knows? I mean, yes, to some degree, maybe people were doing it because they had more camaraderie back then, but also there was a little bit more. There was a little bit more stick. But now people, so it's like maybe part of the obligation, remember you had to make yourself available. And then suddenly people are like, we have to make yourself available for the entire, for just one or two.
And France gone and fucked that up by saying, Bartoli, you can't come on our team. You can't bring daddy. So you can't have the best French player and be like, she can't come. Why not? Because we don't like her daddy. And she and her daddy are weird. So,
but I think that's some of the tension, right?
The big reason the Davis Cup died is because the players were asking for years, please give us ranking points and please give us appearance money. Give us some free. They were relying on
Labour Cup just did that in Labour Cup said, we can't give you points, but we can give you coins.
What were they relying on, Brian?
They were relying on players' charity because there were no ranking points given. There still aren't, and there is no money being paid. Now,
there used to be, though. Didn't there used to be some or was it Olympic points? There used to be Olympic points.
But the very fact that they wouldn't give ranking points, because the reason why the players won't do the Davis Cup is because they've got to play a 250, they've got to play a 500 to get the points to qualify for a slam. This is there's huge pressure in the point system because the more points you have, the better seed you have, and so players are judged on their Grand Slams and on their Masters 1000s. That's all they're interested in.
And this is where this again is where
see, this is where some language, this is where some conversation should have been happening. If people wanted something to not compete with you, this is where. But you know what? The thing is, the question is, if maybe, I mean, listen. Who knows what's going to happen? But maybe this raises the bar a little bit for some of the questions, because if you tell me right away that I add points back into the system, what if I say, okay, let's add points? Then, Labour Cup, okay, fine. It's nice that I'm going to get some cash, but this point's really valuable because the points is going to control what I do for the rest of the year, not just this weekend. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like maybe certain things should come back on the table for Davis Cup and Fed Cup, really.
Yeah, but they, as you said, I think very early on, the players need a direct say in this. And if the players go, look, give us points, so we're not rushing, we're not running the wall, trying to pick up points for our tournaments. If they give them some sort of money, now remember, only the top 40 players are cash rich.
Yeah.
Some of these Davis Cup players.
Yeah, and I mean, do we want to be on the hate Federer bandwagon? Some people, Federer tried to fix that. Why? And he kept advocating for that. And some of other people's faves, they don't talk about that. When they are now on the player council, they don't say anything about that issue.
Well, I'm curious. What will it look like with? I mean, you have like you have essentially a new players council right now. You've got Andy Murray. You've got some other folks that are not Djokovic anymore, and Andy Murray is traditionally doesn't go along the same route. So I'm curious to see what his legacy will be on this cup. On this council. What can he advocate for?
Yeah. They have to take Stanley off of that because he was only interested in that Nick story. He was just like, y'all need to get Nick out of here. And that's it.
No, I mean, but listen, by being somewhat of a bit of an outsider who had like a late career surge, he probably has a certain point of view. So the question for me is like, how does this new players council deal with some of these like ongoing challenges? I mean, what's the fresh voice? I don't know. I mean, it seems to me, Jamie Murray was pretty upset because, of course, obviously, I think Davis Cup's important to him, as a doubles person. That's some real legacy there. So, they felt like they weren't heard. So I'm just curious as to how do you sort of take that to the next level?
I think the changes are too little, too late. I think the Labour Cup is Roger picked the right time. It's very opportunistic. It looked great. I may have started off I have critical questions about it, but I think it was a glimpse into how tennis will be communicated as a medium in the future. But I do have worries that the money is going to Roger's Team 8.
Well, yeah, it's theirs. It's their management company. Yeah, no,
they can bring in a legacy aspect to it. Guys,
well, you know what?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Instead of asking maybe journalists, and you can probably, instead of asking where is the money going, can you perhaps then say, could monies be sent out to do X, Y, and Z? Particularly, and I'm kind of disheartened that tennis as an organization haven't responded to the fact that Puerto Rico and Caribbean islands have been decimated, and even Texas, where there's a lot of tournaments.
They could bring the fucking Labour Cup to Puerto Rico next year. That's what they could do instead of Chicago. They could make a point. They could say, yes, sport has a moral obligation. They could look at
but it has a moral obligation in Chicago
but
too.
It just
you don't understand how.
That.
Well, wait, Reels. Also, people don't understand that Chicago is a sort of battleground city in our current administration. It is extremely important for people to understand that Chicago is a sort of catchphrase for certain things. So it has value there. The question is, does Puerto Rico have the infrastructure for something like this next year? That's the goal, right? That would be the goal. I mean, that would be something that you could work towards.
Administration is trying to do that.
I think talking about the Labour Cup is at the Olympics, like to come into a place, put on their show, and then fuck off the day after it's gone, and there's no legacy at all. Guys, I'm due on court.
All right. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Conversation.
This is Team Europe saying.
Yeah, it was a really good conversation, and I enjoyed it tremendously.
Thanks very much.
Feedback.
Okay, again sometime. Bye.
Good luck on your match today.
Hi, I'm late. I've got to run. See you.
All right, bye. Okay, so this was a really good conversation, Andre, and I enjoyed it. We got some a different perspective out there, and I think it was much more nuanced than, a CNN-esque kind of bullshit, where we're just saying, representing a balance.
Well, I'm not, balance. But I think for me, there's still some outstanding questions. I mean, the questions that Brian raised about the funding, the nature of the funding for Labour Cup, I'm entirely uninterested in those because it's a business. I don't need business to do certain things, which, obviously I believe in businesses having moral obligation. But the really big challenge, it seems to me, is that people believe that Labour Cup is set to destroy Davis Cup, which that may
I don't have a problem
with the case, but I don't understand. But many of the challenges with Davis Cup existed pre-Labour Cup and probably will exist beyond Labour Cup if Labour Cup even survives.
Yeah, and I mean, I have no problem with us asking Labour Cup to do transparency and whatever the case may be, and have a moral obligation to help the neighborhood. But I don't have any proof that any other tournament does that.
Well, it's an interesting question. Like you can't ask it to do the same thing as a nonprofit. with its own mission. Laver Cup doesn't have a mission. It's a business venture. Now, obviously, as a business venture, we want it to hold to a certain standard. But all the standards that were being asked of it because it was supposed to function like an ITF event. It's not. And it was supposed to function like an ATP event. It's not. So, like, I'm just confused about that demand. It's a valuable one, but I'm just confused about that ask. But I want to know, if people are worried about saving Davis Cup, what's the work that's going to be done around that?
Yeah, and I mean, and to me, I'm not seeing. I mean, again, everything I can agree with what he's saying, but I'm just like, I'm trying to make Laver Cup the enemy, and just quick on the scene. It's a convenient enemy when everything that we've been talking about with Davis Cup and Fed Cup has been around before Laver Cup was even a thought.
Yeah, that's confusing. You
can't blame Laver Cup when the ITF just run around and decided, they're not listening to anyone and came up with a bullshit plan. You stumbled over yourself here in this situation. Like, you had an opportunity to do something bigger, and you had time. You heard about the Laver Cup 14 months ago. Stick it in Geneva.
It's not the same audience. This is what it means. Like, it's not. It's like saying how can a 3-day event replace
a 6-7 day event?
An event that lasts what? How many of them? There are 4 of them. Four events throughout the year. One in April, one in September, and then you know what I mean? Like, how are you expecting a 3-day event with 12 people to replace a valuable event that attracts all sorts of people? I understand it in terms of TV eyes and TV coverage and all of that jazz, but I still haven't had anyone explain to me why that needs to replace Davis Cup. And if it's going to replace Davis Cup, how is Davis Cup going to change? Fine. By what? Replicating the Laver Cup model by making it a Geneva event? I'm so confused by it. I'm confused by the critique.
I can't blame. I can't be. Laver Cup might have its issues and it might be evil and whatever the case may be, but let's be honest, this is corporate world. And all of these organizations are evil. They don't have any real moral obligation to anyone but themselves, but enriching their pocket.
But it's not just that, though. It's not. I mean, Laver Cup as a business is separate from ITF, which is some of these are nonprofit events. They have specific mission that they have to execute. That's fine to me. But they have an obligation. Why would you project that obligation onto a business? Which, by the way, listen, I'd love it if businesses did. Like, if you're going to go to Chicago, I want you to take some of the money that happens out of there, and I want it to feed back into Chicago tennis. And I think there's some value to that.
And don't give them $10,000 with a photo op check. That is bullshit.
Yeah. No, none of that stuff. But hello, that's what they do at ATP events, and everybody's fine with that. So I mean, like,
that's what I'm saying. That's my problem.
Really strange. It's really strange to me.
You can't. It's like I don't want to say it's very. I guess it's so modern era, right? It's like you can come and ask Laver Cup to be all of these things and do all of these things
when you're not even able to do it at Wells.
You're not asking the other people this and whatever. And I mean, ITF I don't see when Davis Cup time comes around before, we only show the tie that's in your country. We don't try to show the ties from other places when it's happening basically throughout the whole 12 24 hours. You understand what I'm saying? Like, because of the very near, like particularly in the beginning of the year, because it's all over the place, a Davis Cup match is being played at some place all over throughout the 24-hour period. And we're not trying to do that and fix that and trying to bring more coverage. So it's a lot of issues. And I think folks just get hung up by the fact that Roger Federer is able to pull this in one place. And it's not Roger Federer, it's the venture capitalist. So if y'all need to probably make bed with a few other people and probably organize yourself better, because tennis has money.
I don't know. The whole thing is confusing to me. I'm trying to understand it. Nobody's been able to explain to me why Davis Cup and the leadership there doesn't listen to players, isn't giving players what they want. And then at the exact same time, I'm supposed to be really angry about something else. I believe in organizational structures being held accountable for what it is that they want to do. And so when you're going to offer a critique, I want to know why the governing bodies aren't aren't moving and doing things in response to the critiques that have been offered. It's fine if you want me to make Laver Cup a villain, I will, but I don't know what kind of a villain I need to make it when there are structural challenges within ITF that needs to, and I mean, we already talked about how I think a popular event, or how we think a popular event can help lower ranked events get some legs and what that looks like.
That
because
would be all of these things, they don't have cross marketing like we discussed last week. They don't talk about, here right now in St. Petersburg.
Hey, we could barely get the ATP and the WTA to help each other out.
And plus, and not only that, we can barely see you on TV, and that is the biggest of the issue.
They have their own.
Laver Cup was able to get, and WTA Laver Cup won't doing you anything because we don't see you anyway. So stop telling lies.
They're on WTA TV, and if you want to, you can play for beIN Sports. So it is on TV. It's just that it's a different sports package for different people to pay for. Anywho, that was an interesting conversation, but still leaving me with lots of open questions. If anyone understands, if anyone knows more clearly about sort of the money structure behind Laver Cup, we'd love some feedback on that. You can DM us, or you can
the money structure for other ATP and WTA events in the ITF, because I'm very interested in knowing how they work.
The ITF, they issue annual reports. They issue annual reports, dude.
I haven't read those bullshit. I know. Particularly on the USTA side. I know when I'm reading Slim Plan.
Well, let's listen. I've been warned that we go too long, so let's shut it down. Let's make sure.
Let's shut it down. So thank you, and Janina, your pay has been docked.
Yes.
So just so you know that. Yes, Andreen did the hard work today, so she's gonna get your pay this week. And Unreal's gonna be like Federer and just take millions and millions of dollars,
All righty, all right. We'll keep the ongoing investigation. Let's see this rivalry. Let's continue to monitor this Davis Cup versus Laver Cup rivalry that has emerged.
ITF, the ITF versus the Laver Cup. So it's the Haters Cup versus the Laver Cup. I like that. I really like that.
No. Actually, I think you should do the reverse. No, let's do the reverse.
The Laver Cup versus the Haters Cup.
No, the haters. The Davis Cup versus the Haters Cup. You've got to give the newbie the other side of that.
It's true. Yeah. Laver Cup, you trying to show up as Johnny Come Lady, trying to fuck up everything.
Yeah, you can't be.
You're a hater.
Yes.
It's Laver Cup is the hater.
Yes, Laver Cup is the hater. All right.
All right, then have a good evening. We'll be back next week.
Yes.
With a roundup of what's happening in Asia. For those who can actually watch tennis. Insomniacs.
About to enjoy Beijing, and then Shanghai is about to start, and then it's promptly going to be over, and then we're going to be ready to go. But also Tokyo.
And the race to Shanghai is about locked up.
It's going to be locked up. It should be locked up by the end of the week. So this is going to be really exciting for us to talk about that too.
Next week. So good day, everyone. And don't forget to comment below and rate us on iTunes. We need money, and we need to be big than we are right now. Good night.